What would happen if a CEO was denied access to the business lounge of the very airline he founded? What comes next might just shake the entire aviation industry. A rolling suitcase glided slowly across the polished tile floor of Denver International Airport as Evan Monroe, 47, approached the entrance to the Aerolink Air Business Lounge, the very airline he had founded. With a wrinkled shirt, reading glasses, and an old leather backpack with frayed straps, he looked more like a retired professor or a weary transfer passenger than a high-tier traveler. No Rolex, no Rimowa, none of the urgent swagger typical of first-class guests. When it was his turn to present his membership card, the receptionist gave it a fleeting glance, then smiled with polite indifference. "I'm sorry, sir, this area is reserved for elite passengers. We'll need to further verify your status." No raised voice, no scene, but the words landed cold and sharp, like the edge of a blade. Evan simply nodded, stepped back a few paces, and sat on the row of seats across from the frosted glass door. No reaction, no protest. But as he slowly opened his worn coat, a black leather notebook, its spine softened from years of use, quietly appeared. He opened to a blank page and wrote a single line. "Denied lounge entry, no card check, no questions asked, judged on appearance." That note was the 127th in his journal, but it marked the first time Evan himself had been the subject of judgment. At that moment, a young man with slicked-back hair, wearing a charcoal blazer and carrying an Italian leather bag, approached. No questions, no card check. The same receptionist immediately smiled, tilted her head, and said, "Welcome, Mr. Cole. Seat 1A is ready. Scotch, as usual." Evan watched, unblinking. That was the moment he realized favoritism at Aerolink was no longer a perception. It had become an unwritten rule. Ironically, he was the one who had penned the lounge's original principles over 12 years ago. Back then, he had told the design team, "This will be a place where every passenger feels respected no matter what they wear." Today, no one recognized him. Not because he had disguised himself too well, but because no one truly looked at him. Evan exhaled softly, took out the old fountain pen he always carried, and added another line. Day 1. The roll begins. Under the name Marcus Hale, Evan Monroe began a 2-week journey weaving through the layers of passengers, not as a founder, but as someone entirely anonymous. He wore shirts bought from budget stores, sneakers with worn soles, kept an unshaven face, and wore plastic-framed glasses without prescription. He boarded planes like everyone else, lined up, waited for his group to be called, ducked his head to avoid bumping others, and he took notes. Notes written with the patience of a man who no longer needed to prove anything, yet had never stopped listening. Throughout the journey from Boston to Chicago, from Denver to Atlanta, Evan wasn't seeking warm greetings or courteous gestures. What he sought was the invisible distance, the way an employee glanced at someone wearing a faded hoodie, the extra 2 seconds of smile for a person holding a Mont Blanc bag, the way an elderly woman struggled to lift her luggage into the overhead bin with no help, while a young businessman received assistance before even asking. There were no rude words, no rules broken, but it all followed a quiet rhythm, a silent selection that made people feel less deserving without ever knowing why. Evan never sat in priority seats. He chose the middle seat, tight and inconvenient. To hear how passengers were addressed, to sense the gaze of flight attendants as they decided whom to serve first. In an airport cafe, he witnessed a server asking the travel plans of a man in a suit, while ignoring the one beside him in a denim jacket. He recorded every detail like wordless notes in a symphony, only to realize they composed a score not meant for everyone. What unsettled him wasn't being overlooked himself, but seeing others, those without power, without shares in the company, being silently judged every day without understanding the cause. At the bottom of his notebook on day 5, Evan wrote, "These are not isolated incidents. This is a rhythm, a selective score conducted by glances, handbag brands, and haircuts." And then he underlined the final line 3 times. This is no longer a feeling. This is a structure. That morning, Evan sat at gate C14, holding a cup of bland black coffee and a worn-out notebook. The thin, straight lines of writing stretched across the page like silent evidence of a system driven by prejudice. He hadn't planned to write anything more that day. But then, a warm voice spoke beside him. "They did the same thing to me last month." Evan turned and met the eyes of the man sitting next to him, a man in his 50s, wearing worn-out white sneakers, a faded windbreaker, and a face seasoned by life yet still carrying a trace of humor. "They," he said, referring to the lounge staff. And the same meant being silently judged based on appearance. The man introduced himself. Raymond Lewis, Diamond member since 2008, once a VP of sales, now an independent consultant. "I started dressing more simply, and suddenly everything changed," he said. "No more greetings, no more upgrades, sometimes even got pulled aside for extra checks, even though my account is still top tier." Evan nodded slightly, then asked hesitantly, "Have you ever written it down?" Raymond smiled, then pulled from his backpack a folded sheet of paper, filled with typed lines and red ink notes. The first line was a date, the next a flight number, boarding gate, and then a specific comment. "Staff asked if I was sure I was a business class passenger, then invited the man in a blazer behind me to board first." Evan kept his face composed, but inside it was as if a lock had just snapped shut. That paper, simple, unpolished, was the perfect missing piece to the black leather notebook he carried. He was no longer the only one seeing it. What he had called the silent pattern now had a name, a face, and evidence from someone outside the system. Raymond wasn't angry. He simply gave a faint smile. "I used to think I was imagining it, but then I realized, we're not forgotten, we're re-evaluated." Evan took the paper, placed it next to his notebook, and wrote one short line. "Witness, same system, no longer just assumption." The flight from Atlanta to Los Angeles was 10 minutes behind schedule, but Evan wasn't in a hurry. He sat near the back of the plane, a quiet spot tucked away from the lead flight attendant's line of sight. As passengers slowly took their seats, a young woman in casual clothes approached and sat beside him. Evan looked up and froze for a moment. It was her, Tessa Walker, the flight attendant who had once overlooked an elderly man in Denver while warmly smiling at a passenger wearing a Swiss watch. Now, without a uniform, without the practiced professional expression, she sat comfortably, phone in hand, texting rapidly. Evan wasn't trying to pry, but a name flashed across the screen that he couldn't ignore. Thomas Reddington, the regional vice president he had long suspected of being involved in the so-called behavioral restructuring of service. A message from Tessa read, "Some professor-looking guy causing trouble in ATL lounge, blocked by Sarah, flagged in the system." Evan felt his heartbeat slow. He, under the alias Marcus Hale, had been flagged. This wasn't about personal impression anymore. It was a deliberate action, shared through an internal messaging network. The next message came from Thomas. "If spotted at LAX, use old protocol, re-verify ID. If necessary, refer to additional security screening." Tessa replied swiftly, "Handled. Will alert again if seen." Evan didn't breathe deeply, didn't furrow his brow. He simply reached up to adjust the button of his jacket. But in his mind, the pieces began to align, fitting together like a hidden network long embedded beneath the surface. There was no doubt anymore. They had built a classification system based on appearances, not written down, but enacted through verbal orders and private messages, channels beyond oversight. He wrote in his notebook, "The system isn't unconscious. It is deliberately operated." And for the first time during this entire journey, a powerful emotion surged within Evan. Not anger, but a focused, directed outrage. The hotel room in downtown Los Angeles was dimly lit by a single desk lamp casting its glow over a table strewn with documents. Evan's notebook lay open beside a laptop displaying internal performance dashboards. Beyond the window, headlights on the freeway blazed like a river of light, but Evan paid no attention. What he had just witnessed on the plane meant this could no longer stop at mere observation. It was time to dig into the very system he had once built, to uncover who had twisted it into a tool of silent classification. He sent an encrypted signal to Elaine, his trusted assistant, and the only person who knew about his undercover identity. In less than an hour, backups from the internal control system were transmitted to him. Evan quietly cross-referenced every ID tag, every terminal log, every flag command that had been executed without any standard automated criteria. They had all been manually triggered. And more troubling than anything else, they followed a distinct pattern. Nearly every re-verify order had been issued to passengers with modest appearances. Running shoes instead of leather ones, t-shirts instead of collared shirts, regular luggage instead of branded suitcases. These details were never mentioned in official reports, yet they repeated with disturbing frequency. A list of staff names surfaced: Sarah Jennings, Tessa Walker, Kevin Rowe, all showing activation rates well above average for secondary screening commands. But the most telling name came last: Thomas Reddington, appointed shortly after Aerolink's acquisition of the smaller carrier Everreach, along with a middle management cohort that no one had culturally vetted. Reddington hadn't executed these commands directly, but Evan uncovered a series of policy changes he had approved over the last 14 months under the polished banner of optimizing premium customer interaction. One line in particular made Evan furrow his brow: prioritize passengers with brand-aligned image. He sat still for a long moment. Beneath the disguise of professional language, a new system had been quietly embedded into Aerolink, not to serve better, but to decide who deserved to be treated like someone important. And the power to decide didn't lie with any algorithm, but in the instincts of frontline staff, people who could easily judge based on appearance. Evan opened his notebook, his hand trembling slightly. He wrote each word slowly. Not a system error, not a training flaw. This is a new operating philosophy, and I never authorized it. He underlined the final 2 words in red ink: trace back. That night, he didn't sleep. But when the first light of dawn tinted the skyline beyond the window, Evan had a complete list of those who needed to be held accountable. And a plan to wipe this toxic system from Aerolink's foundation had begun to take shape. There would be no compromise, no gray area left. Only one path remained: trace it to the root and rebuild from the ground up. The elevator glided silently up to the 40th floor of Aerolink Tower, where strong winds from the East River rattled the windows and made every curtain in the office sway gently. Evan Monroe stood upright, his navy suit tailored to fit his shoulders perfectly, his polished Oxford shoes reflecting the pale morning light. The blue silk tie, once his personal emblem from the early days of founding the airline, was tied with practiced ease, like a ritual marking his return. But he wasn't returning to continue. He was returning to confront. Instead of carrying a tablet or a stack of reports as usual, he brought only a single envelope containing his notebook, and a fury distilled into action. Inside the CEO's office, Elaine was already waiting. Spread across the desk were internal documents, HR reports, system access logs, manually triggered override commands at boarding gates. Every name Evan had recorded now came with a corresponding file. We have an emergency board meeting at 11. Legal has been briefed. HR has prepared the termination protocols. No one knows you didn't go to Aspen except me. Evan nodded. He took a seat in the leather chair and began flipping through the files. Sarah Jennings, abusing her authority to deny lounge access to passengers who didn't look premium. Kevin Rowe, repeatedly triggering unauthorized random checks. Tessa Walker, directly coordinating with the regional manager to flag passengers who didn't fit the image. And finally, Thomas Reddington, the man who had transformed a culture of service into a culture of selective hospitality. There's been pushback, Elaine said softly. Larson's not pleased. Says you shouldn't be calling a meeting while technically on leave. Evan gave a faint smile. Then tell him, if he cares about his reputation, he should show up and cast his vote. His hand tightened slightly on Reddington's file. The decisions that man signed, though not explicitly discriminatory, had created the space for such behavior to flourish unchecked. And that, Evan understood, was the real danger. There was no need to declare what was wrong, just the failure to respond when it happened. When the wall clock hit 10:59, Evan rose. He had no presentation prepared, no slides, no need for flowery introductions. What he carried was the truth, documented through his own eyes. And what he was about to do wasn't about defending Aerolink. It was about redefining it. Down the quiet hallway, his footsteps echoed with purpose. No media, no PR. But he knew. That morning, the fate of an airline, and the trust of millions of passengers would be decided in the next 50 minutes. The meeting room on the 41st floor of Aerolink, usually reserved for discussions on marketing strategies and fuel prices, was as silent as a courtroom that morning. 12 chairs were filled by board members, major shareholders, legal representatives, and 2 seasoned former aviation executives. When Evan entered, no one stood to greet him. They could sense the shift immediately from the look in his eyes. A calm, sharp intensity that needed no preamble. "Thank you all for being here," Evan began, his voice low yet firm. "I didn't come with a report. I came with the truth, and this truth cannot be denied." For nearly an hour, he laid out his undercover journey, his personal notes, anonymous videos captured at boarding gates, and excerpts from messages exchanged between flight attendants and their superiors. Each example, each number, each act of covert discrimination was backed by concrete evidence. No one interrupted. It wasn't until he paused after saying, "I, the CEO you serve, was flagged for secondary screening 3 times in 4 cities for wearing a $39 coat, that the room held its collective breath." The eldest board member murmured, "How long have we let this happen?" Evan didn't respond. Instead, he presented an emergency action plan: suspension of all manual override permissions, immediate termination or full investigation of implicated personnel, creation of an independent customer oversight board reporting directly to the CEO's office, and a requirement for all executives, including himself, to work at least 2 frontline days per year. The CFO spoke first. "This plan won't come cheap." Evan didn't hesitate. "Not as costly as a class action lawsuit, and far less than the price of losing our loyal customers' trust." The vote followed immediately. 10 in favor, 2 abstained, no opposition. Evan didn't wait for praise. He stood and said, "The meeting isn't over. I still have something to do." While the board looked on, puzzled, he left the room and walked straight to the executive lounge. There, someone had already been summoned. Thomas Reddington, polished as always, wearing that familiar half-smile. But it vanished the moment he saw Evan waiting, a black folder laid on the table before him. "You called me to discuss the West Coast expansion?" Thomas asked. Evan didn't rise. He simply slid the folder toward him. "I called you here to talk about your definition of premium customer." As Thomas flipped through pages filled with evidence of abuse and facts he could no longer deny, the smile faltered, replaced by veiled threats. Evan didn't engage. He spoke only one sentence, quiet yet chilling enough to freeze the air in the room. "You thought no one was watching. You were wrong." 3 minutes later, internal security entered. As Thomas was escorted out, he glanced back, perhaps hoping for one last chance. But Evan didn't look. He was already opening the next folder. Because for him, the purge had only just begun, and no one, not even those with the highest titles, would be exempt from the principle he had just reinstated: respect without condition. Exactly at 9 a.m. the next morning, the red light blinked on inside Aerolink's internal broadcast room. From airport lounges to pilot rest cabins, from maintenance bays to baggage belts, more than 24,000 employees tuned in to witness a speech unlike any in the company's history. No script, no glamorous backdrop, just the image of Evan Monroe in a dark suit, sleeves rolled high, standing alone in front of the camera. "You may know me as the founder of Aerolink," he began, his voice steady and low. "But you may not know that I was once a college freshman, lost in a strange airport, stranded after a canceled flight with no money and no bed to sleep in. I once asked a female employee for help, and she simply looked at me and said, 'Figure it out yourself.'" That night, I slept on the floor next to a vending machine that had swallowed my last $3. I swore, if one day I ever had the power, I would never let anyone who passed through Aerolink's gates feel the way I felt that night. Evan paused, took a deep breath, eyes locked on the lens. I forgot that promise, but over the past 2 weeks, as an anonymous traveler named Marcus Hale, I remembered. He spoke of his undercover journey, of refusals without paperwork, of the bias that lurked behind professional smiles. We failed, not because we were incapable, but because we allowed a shadow system to decide who deserved to be treated with respect. Then his voice slowed. That ends today. Evan announced the actions already taken: the suspension of all manual override privileges, the termination of 17 employees including management, and the formation of a customer advocacy council composed of individuals who had once been discriminated against. More than that, he said, I and every member of our executive team will spend at leleast 2 days a year working frontline positions, serving passengers the way you have for so many years. A long silence followed, not from hesitation, but from the weight of truth. And if you ask why I'm telling you all this, Evan concluded, the answer is simple. Because silence is complicity, and Aerolink will no longer be complicit. As the studio lights faded, the video ended, and the live broadcast cut off. Something irreversible had shifted. Trust was rebuilt not through apology, but through tangible action. And in the hearts of employees, whether in an airport lounge in Alaska or beside a baggage carousel in Dallas, they all understood today was an entirely different day. 1 week later, as the media continued to speculate about the most sweeping reform in aviation history, Evan Monroe quietly returned to where it all began. Gate C-14 at Denver International Airport. No longer in the guise of Marcus Hale, he wore a modest, well-tailored suit, carried no security detail, and no one recognized him as the CEO. He stood in a quiet corner, simply observing. The young employee who had replaced Sarah Jennings was working with focused eyes. An elderly couple approached, their luggage bulky, no premium tags, no designer suitcases. Evan held his breath. The employee didn't hesitate. She greeted them with a warm smile, checked their tickets, then stepped out from behind the counter to help the woman lift her heavy suitcase. No trace of hurry, no judgment in her eyes. Nothing extravagant, but nothing was missing either. Just genuine presence. Evan didn't intervene. He simply stood still, watching silently, then gave a quiet nod. He knew that a small act like this couldn't undo what had happened, but it was the first sign that a new culture was beginning to take root. Right in the places that once seemed the most ordinary. That evening, Evan invited Raymond Lewis to his office. No press, no social media, just 2 men who had once been turned away by the very system they remained loyal to. Evan didn't speak much. He handed Raymond an envelope containing 2 business-class tickets to any destination Aerolink served, a simple gesture of thanks. But the real gift was something smaller. A card inviting Raymond to join the newly formed Customer Advocacy Council. Raymond was stunned. I was just the guy who spoke to you at the airport, he said. Evan smiled. And that conversation made me see everything differently. Raymond nodded, then gave Evan's hand a firm shake. Just promise me one thing. Don't let this happen again. Evan looked him straight in the eye, unblinking. I promise. Never again. And as Raymond left, Evan sat back at his desk, pulled out his final notebook, and wrote one last line before closing it for good. Respect is not an added feature. It is the flight. The next day, every Aerolink employee received an update to their training protocol. At the top of each onboarding document, there was only one bolded line. Every passenger, every time. 1 month after the earthquake known as Marcus Hale, Evan Monroe sat alone in the glass-walled office atop Aerolink's headquarters, gazing down at the tarmac where aircraft continued their steady rhythm of arrivals and departures. The coffee in his cup had long gone cold, but he hadn't taken a sip. On his desk lay a fresh stack of reports. Reform updates from the 10 largest airports, customer feedback on new policies, early results from the Customer Advocacy Council. Not all were positive, but one theme ran consistently throughout. People had begun to feel seen. As Evan turned through each page, Elaine stepped in, holding a cream-colored envelope with no return address. They left it at the front desk, she said. No one knows from whom. Evan opened it. Inside was a handwritten note, slanted neatly, with only one simple line. Thank you for not looking away. Key. A passenger once ignored for wearing ripped jeans and carrying an old laptop. No signature, no flight number. But Evan understood. The reform he had launched didn't just change policy. It changed how a system defined humanity. Once, value was measured in loyalty points, brand name luggage, or the gleam of a wristwatch. Now Aerolink was beginning to redefine what it meant to be worthy, not by appearances, but by action. At airports from Seattle to Miami, staff had started following the first 2 seconds rule. In the first 2 seconds, look into the customer's eyes, not at their shoes. New internal performance reviews no longer asked only about processing speed, but about how respect was offered, without conditions. Each quarter, a new group of frontline employees joined the strategic advisory panel. Not for seniority, but for their ability to reflect real values. One Friday afternoon, Evan visited Aerolink's new training center. On the wall, among portraits of generations of flight attendants, security officers, pilots, and support crew, was a newly mounted bronze plaque bearing just one line. Respect doesn't require a ticket class, only the willingness to see the person first. Evan stood there for a long time. He didn't need a photo. He didn't need applause. In a world where power is often mistaken for privilege, he had chosen to prove the opposite, by returning to being someone with none. And in that invisibility, he had found what mattered most, a promise made at 19, a promise he once forgot, but had now fully kept by remembering. And somewhere among the millions of passengers each year, someone will walk up to the check-in counter with an old suitcase, anxious eyes, and clothes that don't match the brand standard. But this time, they will be the first to receive a smile, because someone once stood in that exact moment and changed the skies forever. A business is only truly strong when it dares to see itself from the ground up, where the overlooked glances often reveal the truth more clearly than any report ever could. Evan Monroe's story is not just an investigation, but a lesson for every leader. Respect does not come from rank. It comes from daily choices. If you believe fairness begins with the smallest of actions, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss real stories like this one. And don't forget to leave a comment with the phrase, "See it right." A reminder to us all that sometimes a fair look can change an entire system.